Hey there friends, I have another yoga basics video for you today, and this one is all about back bends. Back bends are a pretty glorified category of yoga poses, right? We do tons of them in various and sundry positions, from lying down on our backs, face down on our bellies, kneeling, standing, lunging, right? All sorts of different back bends. There's no way for me to cover all of them in one video. So I'm really just gonna cover the more common ones that you might see in a typical yoga class. You don't necessarily have to have any props, but if you do have a yoga bolster, I like a flat one for the one particular place I'm going to use it, and yoga blocks. I'm going to offer some options in a couple of different poses where those props can make your back bend more comfortable. You could substitute pillows or something like that, or blankets for a bolster if you wanted to have that handy just in case. And just a reminder that your yoga pose is not going to look like my yoga pose or anyone else's yoga pose, because we all have different bodies, different shapes, and it's not important really what it looks like. It's more about the intention behind what you are trying to accomplish with that pose, right? So I'm not going to give you any hard and fast alignment rules per se. I'll give you some things to think about, starting with, what is a back bend anyway, right? So the spine moves in some different ways, and back bends are one of those ways, and those are our spinal extension poses, right? The opposite of flexion or rounding or folding forward, right? And I don't really like to think about back bends as being back stretches per se, right? They're more back strengtheners. And when I say back, I don't just mean our back muscles, right? The entire back body is more the working part to achieve that shape. And really, the front body typically can feel and achieve more length or stretch out of our back bend poses. We do passive back bends and active back bends, and there's always a lot of different things going on depending on our position and which pose we're doing. Some of the ones I'm going to cover today are a lot of the lying down ones, like up dog, which is very, very common in more active styles like vinyasa. It's part of the vinyasa sequence. Cobra, which is fairly similar to up dog. I'll talk about the difference between the two. Some of the passive ones that we see in yin are Sphinx and Seal. And two other face down ones that I'll cover are Locust, which is one of my all-time favorites, and Bow, which are, also super common. We'll do the most common kneeling back bend, Camel, which in my experience is on a lot of people's least favorite lists. So hopefully some of the tips I'll give you will help with that. And from a supine position, a lying down on our back position, we will cover bridge pose. I'm not going to cover upward bow or wheel pose today, just because I have a whole separate video that covers just that one pose, and some tips for getting into that. So if you would like to practice that one after this one, that would probably be helpful to you as well. So, all that being said, commonly, a lot of yoga classes, you'll see some spinal movement warm up at the very beginning of class. One of the most common ways we do that is on hands and knees with cat-cow, right? So cow is our back bend, our spinal extension pose. Cat is our spinal flexion pose. All right, so let's just kind of go through a few rounds here just so you can get warmed up. And we'll just kind of notice what we're feeling, what we're doing, both in the spine, of course, and remember to think about the whole length of your spine, right? From your tailbone all the way up through your neck. And then think about the other body parts that are moving. So I like to move the feet back and forth. Some people do that, some people don't. Our hands are also giving us a little bit of a push here, right? And they can give more of a push if you kind of send your awareness there, right? A lot of our back bends have a pushing element, right? Be it into the hands or the feet, or other things, or a combination of those things. So let's take a moment to hold in our cow here and just notice what we feel. And then let's hold our cat. And again, kind of notice what we feel. And more than likely, you probably are not thinking a whole lot about what you're doing in cat-cow, right? Because it's pretty simple, except for the pressing of the hands and the feet, maybe a little bit. Not really feeling like there's a lot of work happening, right? Which is completely fine, right? And it's just a great way to start to bring awareness to that area. There are other places where we might do cat-cow. When we get to our sort of combination of back bends into a little flow, at the end of the video, we will do a little bit of cat-cow movement in a different position. And I really like to incorporate that cat-cow movement in a lot of my classes in some different positions. So just keep that in mind, that cat-cow does not always have to be in one position, right? You can move through spinal extension and flexion in a variety of positions. So from here, let's go ahead and come down to our bellies and get into Sphinx pose, which is a yin yoga pose, although I do it in a lot of my yoga classes. I think it's the most literal looking yoga pose, right? Elbows about under the shoulders. It looks just like the Sphinx to me, unlike some of our other poses that I can't quite figure out why it was named that. Sphinx can be done passively, so if that's your intention, which it certainly is if you're taking a yin class, you can be really super relaxed and schlumpy about your position. I'm not sure if schlumpy is a word, but I'm making it one. You might have a block to rest something on, or a pillow, or a bolster, and the only work you might feel is that your elbows are holding you up, right? And if that is your intention, then great, right? It's a pretty simple pose for most of us to do. Some of us who have never practiced yoga probably have done this position without knowing it, right? If you ever get down on the floor to maybe, play with a child, they do this pose a lot without knowing it. The more intense variation on Sphinx, or the sister pose that you might also see in a yin class in particular, is seal, which is a similar shape, but lifting up a little bit higher by being on the hands instead of on the elbows, right? So we've got more extension happening through the spine. Sometimes I like to go in between those two, right? And even though these are common yin poses, passive poses, that doesn't mean that you always have to do them that way. So how do we make passive position, more active. Those words can have different meanings depending on the context. In this kind of position, for me, that means not just slumping and hanging out. It means pressing, pushing down a little bit more, using some other muscle groups. So you can see how when I push down into my elbows more, my chest is a little bit more forward, my shoulders are down, they're depressed rather than elevated. Another thing that can be really a game changer for back bending, depending on your intention, is to bring more engagement, awareness, muscle contraction to your glutes. So you can sort of, in this position, maybe go through some rounds of contracting the glutes. Notice what you feel, and then relax the glutes and notice what you feel. Notice the difference between the two. I feel a huge difference in my active sphinx versus my passive sphinx. For some people, depending on the state of your lower back, and that can entail any number of things. I feel less, I feel less in my lower back when I contract my glutes. One of the main functions of your glutes is to help with spinal extension and hip extension, which are what's happening in our back bends. So when we recruit them, when we contract them and use them, for a lot of us, those poses feel better in that one area. That's the case for me, for sure. And that might be more important to remember in different back bends. With the amount of extension that you're doing, you may or may not want to contract your glutes depending on how your back feels and what your intention is. That goes for seal as well, right? If you are really kind of slumping into it, that might feel one way. If you are giving more of a press, squeezing the glutes, right? It feels different. It's not right or wrong to do it one way or the other. It just depends on what you're trying to achieve and how your body feels about things. Yeah? You can also adjust those two positions with where you're placing your arms, right? So the closer in your elbows or your hands are, right? So in Sphinx, if those elbows are really close in towards your ribs, you're in more extension. The further forward they go, you're in a little bit less of an extended position. Same goes for seal, right? The more you walk your hands in, the more extended you are. And the further away they get, the less extended you are, right? So you can adjust that as well. Remember, I was talking a minute ago about how back bends are back body strengtheners, front body stretchers, right? So depending on your intention and your position, you might feel some front body stretching, some abdomen stretching in one of these positions. The higher I lift and the more active I make it, I can feel some stretchiness on the front side, yeah, my belly. Okay, so from here, let's just kind of come on down and take a moment to let our backs rest, right? Because we still have a ways to go. I like to wiggle the hips side to side. You might also do a little bit of kind of cat-cow-like movement just for the lower spine here, right? So kind of tucking the tailbone down and then relaxing. You might feel the glutes start to come into play when you send your tailbone down, right? I can feel that a little bit as well. we're gonna move on to Cobra and Up Dog, which are fairly related. So let's do Cobra first. So we're gonna take the hands beside the chest, and if we were doing a vinyasa style class, a flow style class, if we were in plank and then lowered all the way down, we would probably land about here. So you can do, I call it baby cobra, just a small amount of lift here. And think about, as you move up and down, what you're feeling, what actions are at play. Can you make it a little bit more active by pushing what's staying down a little bit more and engaging your glutes a little bit more? And if you wanted to lift into a higher cobra position, right, your hands are gonna have to work more, right? Full on cobra, if you were to get those arms all the way straight, is a pretty deep back bend. Most people keep their elbows bent. And for me, I can really feel more the upper back muscles a little bit higher than just the lower back area. Working as I lift up a little bit higher into Cobra. So if that's Cobra, what is Up Dog? So Up Dog is not just Cobra-ish with straight arms, right? For Cobra, really the pelvis is still down, right? And I can't do that with my arms straight. So I like to think of Up Dog as kind of a planky back bend is what I typically call it. And we have traveled from plank in a vinyasa sequence to get to Up Dog. So in Up Dog, the arms are straight, but the pelvis and the hips are hovering above the mat. We are on the tops of the feet and the legs are active, right? To me, it kind of depends on your perception and your body. As far as back bending goes, Up Dog is harder in a lot of ways because it's more about strength, right? Because you're using your legs and you're lifting yourself up and you're holding yourself up more. But it's not as much of a back bend as Cobra, right? And again, you can adjust how much you are feeling in either of those poses by how much you are engaging, contracting your glutes, your legs, right? So in Up Dog, I'm really kind of squeezing everything back there. My knees are lifted, I'm just on the tops of my feet. Now, some people have a hard time with being on the tops of their feet for any number of reasons, just lack of ankle mobility. If you have any issues with plantar fasciitis, being on the tops of the feet can feel really uncomfortable. So you don't have to do Up Dog on the tops of your feet. You could do it with your feet flexed, with your toes tucked under, and everything else is pretty much the same. In fact, it's easier in a way, right, to keep the legs lifted, right? That feels a little bit harder. There's a little more lift when you are on your toes. So, a couple of things that you could think about with that. Next, we're going to do locust. Locust is, it's one of my favorite back bends, like I said earlier. It's really, really good for back strengthening. You'll see variations on locust pose done in, not just in different arm positions. So there's all kinds of ways you could get into locust. A lot of times we are lying down and then we just kind of lift everything up, right? So the arms are lifted, the chest is lifted, the legs are lifted, we're pointing the toes. If we're just hanging out and not really feeling muscle engagement or muscle contraction, we may not get much lift. So that's another thing to think about, is how much am I pushing down and engaging my glutes, my legs, as I reach. You will often see locust with hands clasped behind the back, which is fine and can be helpful to help you feel that pull back. But can you keep that amount of lift without? It's just a question. There's no right or wrong answer, or, it's something to think about when we are using something like that to help us get a little further. Same thing when we're doing, a balance pose, hand to big toe, and we're using our hands to help us lift the leg. When we let go, the leg's gonna drop, right? That's the difference between active and passive in that regard in terms of mobility. So something to think about there too. And that's a lot of times what I will ask my students to do is go ahead and clasp your hands if that feels good, and then notice what happens when you release the clasped hands. Can you keep the amount of lift that you achieved by doing that? And then let's just kind of talk about that arm position too, right? The shoulders are in extension, which is a hard position for some people. So working on that in some different ways, some different areas, different positions might be helpful for that pose, in particular if you want to clasp your hands for whatever reason. Another pose that we do face down on our bellies is bow, right? So sometimes I will do it from locust, right? I'm lifted, and then I'll grab and pull. Sometimes you'll see people, start already down and then kind of get into it more passively by grabbing the feet first and then kind of pulling themselves up, right? So there's different ways you can get into it. The reason I like to do it from locust is I've already lifted myself, and I'm gonna do a little bit less cheating, quote unquote, than I would if I just grab my feet lying down. So the thing I said about the arms being back in locust is also at play in bow, right? What else is at play in bow? The knees are bending, right? They're flexing. So if that creates discomfort for you, or you have limitations there, that's going to be something to think about and just kind of keep in mind as part of the equation for bow. You might feel a little bit of stretchiness in the quad. So if you have what you consider to be tightness in that area, that might be something that's limiting there. If you have shorter arms in relation to your torso length, it might be more difficult for you to grab your feet or ankles. You could use a strap. Sometimes props are just a little bit cumbersome to get into the position, so I don't use a strap a whole lot in bow because it's just kind of difficult because you're reaching behind you to see, but that is something that you could consider as well. I have seen bow done grabbing the tops of the feet with toes pointed, which is the way that I do it and the way that feels best for me. I've seen it with feet flexed, grabbing the ankles instead. That feels okay too. You can try it both ways and see how that feels. Bow pose for me that's another one of my favorites after doing locust for the feeling of strength in my back. I like the chest opening feeling of bow. If you have what you consider to be tightness across your chest, that may be a limiting factor in your bow pose, right? So you could do some chest opening work and stretches there, and I've got videos for all of that too. One way you can help with a prop for bow pose is to use something like a bolster to give you some of that lift. If you kind of rest your pelvis on top of it, right, you're already, right, you don't really need your hands to hold yourself up, right? You can do a little half locust, grab, right? And that feels really nice. You can be a little bit higher up. My legs are still down in this variation because of that bolster. And that feels really good. One of the things that I haven't talked about yet, I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the next pose we're going to do, but even for our lying down back bends, one thing to also think about is what you're doing with your neck, right? And as I mentioned, back bends, spinal poses, we're thinking about the whole length of the spine, tailbone up through the neck. But think about the different curves in your back, right? The back bendy parts of your back are your lower back, right? And your neck, right? Those are the two curves that go along with our back bendy shapes. And it can be easy to quote unquote dump into those areas. When we use the glutes, like I mentioned in those lying down back bends, that helps with the dumping issue in the lumbar area, in the cervical area, and your neck. It's not quite the same thing, right? We don't have the same issue going on with glutes helping, but it's real easy just to feel like you gotta throw your head back, right? But that doesn't feel good for most of us. So when you're doing those prone back bends, lying down, right, I always like to start with a feeling of length through my neck and letting my head be the last thing to go. And I just typically tend to, whichever one I'm doing, look more forward than anything. If I decide I want to let my head drop back, before I do, I'm gonna get more length first, even at the top, draw my ears back, and then go back. And that feels completely different for me than just, ow, that doesn't feel good at all. So another thing to think about there. And that we can put into our camel pose bit of tips as well. So camel is our most common kneeling back bend, right? And a lot of stuff going on. Typically we reach for the heels. You can get into your camel pose coming to it from above and reaching back, or sort of being down and lifting up into it, right? Just like you can be all the way down on your belly and lift up into bow, grab your feet first and pull up, or already be up and then So, a couple things to think about for camel. For me, I like to, again, give my lumbar area some support by making sure I'm not just gonna dump into it, by giving the glutes a little bit of a squeeze and finding a little bit more space by thinking tailbone down, right? If you do a little cat-cow here, kneeling, I feel the difference in my lower back. It feels a little bit, for lack of a better word, crunchy when I go into my lumbar extension there, into my anterior tilt of the pelvis. If I tuck under, I don't feel that. For some of us, that's uncomfortable to feel that. So if you feel discomfort in your lower back in camel, big recommendation, big game changer. Think toward a posterior tilt of the pelvis, tailbone down. Give the glutes a little squeeze. Yeah, that already feels pretty good for me in my lower back. Really, the thoracic area, right above the lumbar area, is the part of the spine that, or the next part of the spine up, that wants to move in the opposite direction. It wants to be rounded, right? So that's the part that gets a little bit sticky for most people, which includes being open across the chest. So again, doing some chest opening work will help with your camel. So another thing I like to do after thinking tailbone down, squeezing the glutes, is to use my hands to help me feel like I am lifting upward and making space, almost like, if you could picture your vertebrae, like you're trying to almost like stretch them apart so there's more space in between them. It's not actually happening, but it kind of feels that way. So tailbone down, squeeze your glutes. Give a little push down with your hands on your hips. And then take your hands up higher and lift the rib cage upward, away from your waist, away from your hips, right? Some people hook thumbs in armpits and lift up there. Squeeze your glutes, right? You could call it a day there. Notice I'm not just dropping my head back, right? Ears back first. Then if you want to drop your head back, do it. If you don't, don't. If you wanted to try to reach for your heels, try with toes tucked under first, especially if you don't have long arms. They will be easier to reach, right? Notice I didn't let my hips move back, right? When I let my hips move back, this is one of those right or wrong issues, black and white issues that I don't typically like to adhere to so much, because again, I think that your practice needs to be individual to you. However, when you allow your hips to move back, you're not going to be in as much extension, right? You can see that, right? When my hips are forward, there's more extension happening. So we are attempting, if we're going for more extension and a more traditional shape to camel, we are going for keeping hips over knees. I won't move up to the wall to show you, but I have shown this to students. You could kneel up against a wall, facing the wall, press your legs, your hips into the wall, and then see what happens. You can use blocks, right? Great way to bridge the gap. You can start with them just a little bit back and gradually walk them back, depending on how that feels. And being able to push down into them might help you feel a little bit more lifted and open across your chest, right? Easier to reach because they can go higher than your heels are. You can keep your hands on your back.
Again, if you're gonna let your head fall back, make sure that you lengthen first and draw the back of your head back, ears back, and then see how that feels. Yeah? Camel is one of those, like I said, it can be a little bit scary, a little bit uncomfortable. Hopefully you've got some strategies now to work with that. For me, working on chest opening and using my glutes for help, total game changer. Some people feel nauseous when coming out of camel. Try those strategies. If any of that applies to you, see what that does. All right, so last pose we're going to talk about before kind of combining all that stuff is bridge, which is typically done from lying down. And the thing about bridge is in yoga, we consider it a back bend. In the rest of the fitness world, right, lots of people do bridges. They call them, fitness people call them glute bridges, which implies that you are working your glutes. So I can honestly say for many number of years practicing yoga, when I first started, I never thought about my glutes. But again, they are an important muscle group involved with the actions that we're trying to achieve. So basically, typically, feet about hip width, heels close toward the hips. I see a lot of yoga people grabbing their feet and pulling them as far in as they can toward their bum before going up into bridge. And I really do not know the purpose of that. So ask yourself, what is your intention in doing that? Maybe there was a teacher along the way that said we needed to do that, and we should kind of be able to touch our heels with our hands. For some of us, that's a body proportion thing. I have really long arms, so my feet can be pretty far forward and I can still touch my heels. What you feel along the back chain will be different depending on where your feet are. So let's explore that a little bit. So we'll take arms down by our sides, right? I like to do a little bit, just like I did in camel, right? A little bit of a tuck, right, toward a posterior tilt before lifting, because that helps me feel that I can engage, contract the glutes, and then I'll lift up, right? And depending on what you want to get out of it, if you just are happy to have it be a glute strengthening position, you can stop there. If you want to go more into back bend territory, you can keep lifting and you can kind of walk your shoulders underneath you. Some people clasp their hands underneath, that's more traditional. Think about pressing the back of your head down so that your neck is more neutral, which should be a curve, right? We don't want to press the neck flat down into the mat here. Feel the support of your shoulders. All right, and let's come on down. Take a moment and let's see how things feel different if we take our feet wider apart in bridge. So I'm going out to the edges of the mat. I haven't brought them in or out as far as close to the hips or further forward. We'll try that too, but let's just see how a wider position feels. For me, I felt like my lift, it feels higher. It feels like my chest is against my chin here. It feels pretty good. If I stay up and walk my feet closer in, right, I can feel some differences. You can also feel some differences depending on the orientation of your feet, right? Typically we say toe straight ahead, but how does it feel when you turn your feet out a little bit? I feel a little bit of the glute med, right up there, like the top sides, right? Which, happens when we rotate outward. Feels a little strange to turn in, right? Another way to kind of experience some different feelings on the back body is to lengthen your bridge pose. The further forward we bring our feet, the more our hamstrings are going to work, which is a really important thing to consider if yoga is your main form of exercise. We don't do a whole lot of hamstring strengthening in yoga. We stretch the dickens out of that muscle group. We are very prone to injury. Yoga butt is a very common injury. I have experienced it on both sides, where there's either like a tendinitis issue where the hamstring attaches to the sitting bone, or it can even be a tear, right? Super common when we just stretch and don't strengthen. So lengthening your bridge pose and making the hammies work more is a great way to work on that. So if you always bring your feet super close in, right, you're not going to feel your hammies. Try scooting them a little further away. Yeah? All right, let's think toward a posterior tilt. Squeeze the glutes, lift up. Notice I can feel my hammies. Woo! Lower down. Owie. I kind of like that feeling, even though it's a little bit of an owie. But otherwise, we don't work that muscle group a whole lot. And again, it's important. Yeah. I think I've covered most of the things I wanted to talk about for those poses. So now let's do a little short sequence to kind of combine our back bendy poses. Feel free to grab your props at any point where you feel like you want to. So we're going to come back to our lying down position. Arms down by your sides, right? Back of the head's down, neck is clear. And we're going to do a little bit of a lower spine cat-cow-like movement, pelvic tilting, right? So the lower back lifts, anterior tilt, and then move toward posterior tilt with the low back down. All right, let's try that a few times. And you can inhale, exhale. If you want to work your breath like you would normally do in cat-cow, go for it. And then next time after we flatten and go toward a posterior tilt, continuing that movement, squeeze the glutes and lift up into your bridge. And then lower down. And then another round of the tilting and lifting. Again. One more time. Maybe a hold at the top. Maybe you want to walk the shoulders under more and clasp and see how that feels. Maybe you want to play with foot placement. I kind of like that wide feet turned out position, I gotta say. All right, let's come on down. Take a moment to let your back settle. Hug your knees. Rock a little bit. So this is moving us toward the opposite direction as well. It's sort of a lying down forward fold, right? Which to me feels nice after spinal extension. Okay, let's rock up and come on to hands and knees. And we're gonna move through cat-cow child's pose. back toward a child's pose position. Let's stay more rounded since we're doing so much back bending otherwise. Come back up to cat. Inhale. Cow. Exhale. Cat. Inhale. Sit back. Exhale, back to cat. Again. And then after coming back up, all right, let's just go ahead and walk the hands forward and come all the way down. And just take a moment here to get situated on our bellies. All right, let's take the hands beside the chest. Roll the shoulders back. Let's press into the tops of the feet. Squeeze the glutes. Let's do some baby cobra up and down. All right, again, we're thinking about our neck staying long. And you can just look straight down. If you feel like you want to lift your head, let it be the last thing to come. Maybe start to go a little higher into more regular cobra territory. And then let's keep pressing up into up dog, right? Remember the legs are hovering, legs are active. And then let's lower back through cobra, down and bring the elbows forward for Sphinx. Little hip wiggle. Let's make our Sphinx more active. Push down, squeeze the glutes, lift the legs. Arms back, locust, maybe a clasp. Let go, make sure you're breathing. Let's bend the knees and then straighten them again. Bend, straighten. Bend, straighten. Bend and grab hold if you want to for bow. You can pull if that feels okay, but you don't have to. Can you go back to locust from there and keep your height? And then back to Sphinx. Woo! Maybe to seal from there. Back to Sphinx. Lower down. Wiggle the hips side to side. Do some pelvic tucking. All right, let's press into child's pose. More of the legs together, rounded back. Variation with arms down. And maybe not legs all the way together. Let's say hip width or so. Let's take a moment to let things settle. Okay, we're going to move in between this position and a kneeling position with arms reaching up. And as we go up, think tailbone down, give the glutes a little squeeze and kind of press forward, and then lower back down. Lift up. Lower down. Lift up. Lower down. Lift up. Okay, from here, just kind of take your arms down, tuck your toes, and let's take a moment to sit on the heels from there. And we're going to practice some camel-like movement from sitting on the heels, toes tucked under. So from here, I've got my fingers kind of touching my heels. I'm going to press upward into a camel-like position and keep one hand on my heel and reach the other arm up and sit back down and then switch and sit back down. Let's do it again, both sides. And then maybe keep both hands in place. You could have blocks, you could be pointed toes,
can keep your gaze forward or not. And let's take it back to child's pose. Breathe. Rest. All right. So, backbends are complicated, to say the least, but I hope that I've given you at least a little bit of helpful information so that you can feel better about them in your body and have some strategies to work on them. Thank you so much for joining me, and if you have any requests for these yoga basics classes, I am all ears and happy to respond to those. And I look forward to practicing with you again soon. Have a great day.